Welcome to Cerius Leadership, where we bring you the tools and insights to lead your business with confidence. Today, we're continuing our Strategic Advisor series and diving into a topic that can be a business owner's biggest asset or its biggest liability, their attorney relationship. Today, I'm thrilled to have Keith Allen with me. Keith, you bring not only years of legal experience, but also very unique perspective on the intricacies of the law that every business leader needs to know. So, whether you're looking to protect your business, want to be proactive about avoiding legal matters, or gain practical insights that you can apply today, we'll cover it on this episode. Keith, I am so thrilled to have you here with me.
It is a pleasure to be here. Good to see you again. And thank you very much for having me.
And you and I just keep seeing each other again and
Yeah,
again. I think
absolutely. Yeah, right.
we met probably a few years ago and reconnected recently. It was a large group dinner. We happened to be sitting across from each other, and you were talking about this passion you had for how do I make it easier for business owners to be proactive and avoid actually needing my litigation services. And I think that you and I had one of those Jedi mind melts
Yes,
and
yes.
started talking about, I was like, I have the strategic advisor series. I absolutely think that every business owner needs a strategic advisor team around them, from attorneys, their CPA, their financial advisor, and they're talking to each other for all in the interest of how do we protect the owners and the business. From your decades of litigating, how much of it do you think could have actually been avoided?
That's the best question, right? I think probably 75, 80% of the litigation that I am could have been avoided. And a lot of my clients don't call me the litigator, they call me their business attorney. And what does that mean? It means I'm looking out for the business. Once we get into litigation, we go back, we figure out what actually happened here, and we say, well, how do we stop it from happening again? Right. The point of business is for everybody to make money, even the people that we're fighting with, right? We got into a deal with them because we had a contract that we thought would make everybody money. And the idea is, how do we avoid these disputes? How do we stop them quickly so everybody can get back to making money? Right. That's my passion. That's what drives all my business owners.
And when you said once we get through litigation, we talk through, and it's almost like a postmortem of if we had a crystal ball, what we done differently. And you've created a playbook around that for, okay, now how do I take all of those crystal balls and use that for businesses going forward?
Okay.
What would be some of the most common things that you would say end up in your playbook time after time again, saying, first thing I do when I sit down with a business, we go over these things because if push comes to shove, this is where it's going to save us.
Sure, absolutely. So there are a few different phases of a business, right? There's when you're just opening it up. And then, there's kind of when you're getting the contracts going, and then when we're going strong, right? So let's talk about when you first open the business. When you first open the business, the things a business owner needs are a very strong operating document, especially if they're in it with a partner. And so what we want to do is make sure it's very clear who's going to be doing what are the limits of authority without talking to the other partner, and then kind of moving forward from that, it's kind of stuff like what we call buy-sell agreements. So let me break all this down, right? In the very beginning, you want to know who's the president, who's the treasurer, who's the secretary, who's going to be handling the money. And then in addition to that, you want to make sure how much somebody can spend without actually without approval from the other partner. Very important, right? If you start out, you're making $100,000 a year, you don't want your partner to spend more than $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000. If it's $1 million business, right? Maybe that's now 15, 50,000, something like that. You want to make that very clear. So when your partner does something that you don't want them to do, or at least if you're questioning what you want to do, you want to make it very clear what it is. The buy sell agreement is very simply this. It limits the ways your shares can be transferred to other people. You don't want your partner to now sell it to somebody else and kind of leave you with somebody you didn't have a relationship with, or for God forbid, if your partner were to die, you don't want to deal with their spouse, right? You want the company to be able to buy them out and move on. So that's the very first phase. But as the business matures, right, you want to make sure that your contracts are very clear on what you do. The biggest fight that I see from time to time and time again is, what did we contract with a third party, right? What did we actually say we were going to do? When businesses start, their contracts are very general, and maybe they're a page, maybe they're two, but they don't say exactly what the parameters are of the relationship. That's what stops litigation, and also makes it very clear when you're talking with somebody, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm not going to do. And whenever you have a dispute, it's great to pull out a document and say, well, that was what I contracted with you to do or not, right? It's always about communication. And as you go forward, right, we get form contracts for almost everything that happens in your business that, once again, spell everything out. All right, so let me give you a little example, and then I'll give it back to you for a question, I guess, or for you to expound upon it. I once I had a company that was separating. There was a two-person company, and they decided to go ahead and separate, go their own ways, and we calmed everything down. We gave them a great deal for how they're going to split up. And unfortunately, I guess for the guy that I was representing at the time, he had a non-compete or a non-solicitation
Mhm.
clause that we put into the contract. And he decided, oh, well, I kind of do want to compete with the company. And so what we did, we went back to his former partner and we said, okay, this is what we want to do. And it was a great conversation because we knew that if we breached the contract, it was very clear what the next steps were. So when you're in a very defined area, you can say, okay, well, how much is this particular portion of the contract worth? How much is that particular portion of the contract worth? And when you've got that in an agreement, now I can negotiate, and it makes it a very defined and confined kind of a negotiation. And then, then we can actually talk. And that negotiation was finished within a week, right? That's what it's all about, making sure everything is clear and everybody knows what's going on.
In litigation, and when it gets to that point, do you find that it's because it wasn't spelled out, things weren't clear, and we don't have a rule book for how to manage this situation? Or is it we just don't like the original terms that we spelled out? Kind because you just mentioned a piece of that. Fortunately, you were there to be proactive and say, let's just talk this through like adults. But you've got two different situations there. Where do you see the biggest pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on both of them, and there's another one too that I'll talk about, which is communication, right? I mean, that's another big issue. But when let me start at the very beginning, right? When I'm opening up a contractual discussion with somebody else or a negotiation, I always tell my client, look, you're about to get for lack of a better term, in bed with the other person, right? You're about to
Mhm.
have a relationship with them. And right now you're in that honeymoon phase where you both think you're going to make billions and billions of dollars, which is perfect. But nobody thinks at that time about what happens if it all falls apart. And so I always tell my client, I know we don't want to think about this. Business owners are always straightforward. We want to make money. Well, let's take a few minutes out and think about what happens if this doesn't work out. What is it that you want to accomplish? What do you want to have happen? What is it that's most important to you? And then let's draft whatever the agreement. Let's draft it so that your biggest needs are in it, right? And so yes, but the parameters of the contract actually make litigation happen, right? If we know that, let's just say you're a technology company and you want to keep the rights to the actual software that's there, right? Well, if that's in the agreement, you guys don't fight about it anymore. It's there in black and white, and so we can usually say what's most important and lay it out. Now, here's a little secret to most litigation. All right, if somebody is completely right and it's in the contract that they're completely right or completely wrong, it never gets to litigation. Litigation really happens when people don't really know what the outcome is and they're going to fight over it, right? And the way I always say is, when I have a vague and ambiguous result, right? And I think that what I'm doing is fair or that I'm owed something that's fair, that's when I'm going to litigate. And it's really in that gray area where cases take place. And so my job as a litigator at that point is to point out what my client did that was right in his or her mind, and then convince the judge that a result was fair. The result that I want is fair. You don't want to get to that point if you can deal with it. You'd rather be able to get in front of a judge and say, Judge, not only is what I said fair, but it's also provided for in the contract. And if it's a well-written contract, the attorney on the other side will also say, okay, well, we have to give that up, right? Now, you can't contract for every possibility, but you can do the
I
best you possibly can, right?
I
I
was
mean,
going to
you know,
say, you
yeah.
can't think, come on, Keith, you cannot think of
Yes,
everything. And you also
yes,
can't plan for, I once had someone said you have insurance for litigation, those purposes, not because you probably will do something wrong. People sue out of desperation, not for good reason or logic.
that's right. That's
Do you-
exactly right.
Is that where that communication comes in?
Communication is so key. I always tell my clients, let me know as soon as something goes wrong, because at that point, you're in the phase of this is my partner. We're trying to make money together. And I think he or she did something wrong, right? And as soon as they let somebody know about that, that's the opportunity to repair the relationship. And if you can have a conversation at that point, people's tempers are not raised at that point. They're a little upset, but they don't feel like they're ignored. They don't feel like they're not, they're hurt or anything like that. They're willing to work with you. But then when somebody ignores a person, they let it drag on. They make several contracts, letters, different things happen. Then they start to get upset and they get entrenched in their position. And then when they've paid an attorney thousands and thousands of dollars, they're now like, oh, well, now I want blood. And then it gets into litigation. We don't want that to happen. So, like you said, pitfalls and things that you're thinking about, you definitely want to immediately contact your attorney and get him or her to work on with the other side to resolve it as soon as possible. Otherwise, I will tell you, I have a case right now where I wrote a letter on July, whatever, let's just say, a few
Mhm.
months ago. And the other side ignored me because I was being nice. I told them I want to have a good conversation before this spirals out of control. And they ignored me. I wrote another letter, ignored it. And now I had to send a letter to their bank and I had to send a letter to everybody else involved. And I'm telling you right now, then it became World War III. You don't want that to happen. Solve it in the beginning when everybody's happy, as opposed to when the nuclear bombs have flown across to the other side.
Human nature tends to be conflict avoidance, especially when you look at most of us who are business owners. We're a little high strung to begin with. That's
Yes,
just,
high
I
paid
will
personalities.
self-admitted. It's interesting. I want to dig into this a little bit. A number of the examples that you're talking through from the litigation you've done are business partnerships. Do you find that tends to be more common than, say, a single owner in litigation with customers or vendors, or what makes up most of the business litigation?
Sure. I think it's with partners. You know what? It's probably like 50-50, right? For a larger company with a few different partners,
Hmm.
it's a marriage, right? That's really what it is. And what happens in every marriage, there's going to be some disagreements, right? Somebody's going to do something that's going to upset the other partner. It may take 10 or 15 years, but it's there, right? And hopefully you don't have to get to the point where you're actually calling me or another attorney, but sometimes you do, and then you have to kind of smooth out their relationship. Now, in other companies, it is a vendor issue or an outside joint venture issue or something like that, right? So how does that come up? Say we like to use widgets in the law, right? So
Hmm.
I'd say I've contracted with you to make 100 widgets, right? And in my mind, I think the widget should be some way. In your mind, you've got a product and you think that the widget should be another way. And so what we do is we fight over what the widget should be, when I should get the widget, how much I should pay or when I should pay for the widget, right? All those things that will happen that come up all the time. And then even worse, what happens if the widget breaks, right? And now it hurts some other piece of equipment. Now, who's responsible for that? That's another big issue that happens as well. That's called indemnity or liability or something like that. So go ahead. I'm sorry. It looks like you're about to have a question.
No, I'm thinking through the examples that you have right there and the nuances of there's a general contract, and then there might be, I get a PO, I get a work order, I get any number of things. It doesn't occur to me that maybe I should have my attorney walk through our entire process to understand it and identify, I've seen that lawsuit, I've seen that one, I've litigated that one.
Yes.
Put these in play. Oh, that invoice, why don't you just put this one line on there?
Yes.
Is
Yes.
that the level of involvement that you see in what you do?
Yes. And it's usually in retrospect, in hindsight, right, that
Ah,
comes up because everybody thinks that they know how to draft a contract. I've seen a lot of them. And let me give you an example that happened about 10 or 15 years ago. My client, let's just say he was a consultant and he had an agreement that he thought for sure that if the other side breached it, there would be a confession of judgment. And he drafted that himself. And what a confession of judgment is that if I were to breach, you can walk into court and then you can get a judgment against me for something. What he didn't understand is that the law is very, very specific on those particular issues. And the courts do not like to give out a judgment unless if certain constitutional protections have been met. And so the way it was worded, unfortunately, did not allow him a judgment. We were able to get everything for him. But at that point, the client said, oh, maybe I should have an attorney handle that for me. And that happens with so many different contracts. I don't want to belabor what I said earlier, but yeah, at that, once they get into a contract and they say, oh, I should have had an attorney draft it, then they come to me and they have me draft it. And then, then they can use that going forward. Usually for a lot of my clients, I try to get form agreements. I understand what their business is. I really ask them a lot of questions. And then we figure out if there's 3 or 4 different form contracts that they can use. So 90% of the time they're using those form contracts for their services or for what they're getting from other people. And the other 10% are obviously those one-offs that you really can't anticipate in the very beginning, right?
we see that pretty commonly with the form contracts, but you mentioned you get into that second and third stage of business growth, and you're working with clients who want to edit and change all of those form contracts. And it's so easy and the desire to, but I want this client, especially if it's a big client, I'm just going to agree to it. How do you
Yes.
balance the business growth and business drivers and getting those customers versus you can't agree to that? Let me lay out the risk of this.
Yes. Oh God. So wow, that's a very loaded question, but only because you are talking about when you're dealing with, let's just say Apple. I don't have any clients that are dealing with Apple, but I have Apple like people on the other side that I'm working with, and they're the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and they
Mhm.
say, "This is my contract. I've used this for years, and I'm not accepting anything different." A lot of people think us attorneys would go ahead and send out a letter ripping up everything and then making everything for my client. That's generally not how I approach it. Generally, I make a bullet point list of the things that I think are fair for my client. And then I send that to the other side and say, can we have a discussion? And then what we do is walk through what's fair for my client with the other side's legal team. And instead of us spending hours and hours and hours on things, it's usually like a half-hour conversation. And you can kind of nibble away at what the 800-pound gorilla wants. And you figure out what's really detrimental to your client. And a lot of times that's payment terms, right? The big gorillas don't want to pay you until like what, 100.
45, 60,
Yeah,
90
right,
days.
right.
Yeah. And it
Yes.
just crushes you when you're in that spot. You can't do that.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And they don't, well, they realize it, but they don't, I don't think they care, right? They don't realize that you're doing basically an interest-free loan for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6
Yeah.
months. And if you're a small business, that's stinks, right? I mean, how do I make my payroll when I've essentially loaned this big gorilla,
Hmm.
$800,000 or 500,000 or $200,000 that won't be paid for 6 months, right? I've seen companies have some serious issues in that situation. But that's number one, right? And that's just one. But the other one is liability, right? The big companies want you to be responsible for everything. But is that really fair to you? Is it fair to you that they design a product that is faulty and now you put it out and now you're responsible for it? So we walk through those types of issues. Other things that we deal with. Oh my goodness, it's all over the place, but it's usually like what we call Incoterms or shipping terms, right? When are you responsible for them? When are you not responsible for the goods once they shipped from the port? What happens if they get lost in transit? What happens if your services, right? If they have an issue with it, when should they tell you that they have an issue? Do you have an opportunity to cure whatever the problem is? And if you do have an opportunity to
Hmm.
cure, when does that happen? These are all issues that we attorneys look over because we know that those are the things that really do lead to the disputes, right? If you have 10 days to cure something under the contract, well, then it's great when they notify you, you can immediately come to me and I might be able to even get you more time, right? I might be able to get you more time. I might be able to get an extension. I might be able to do certain things, but we at least know under the contract, you have some time to remedy whatever is going on. And we try to put that in there. And it's so fun. I like to tell my clients when you're dealing with other companies, it's great to have an attorney because it's no longer about you, it's about the attorney. And if I say something that pisses off the other side, just you can wave your hand and go, oh, it's
That's
the attorney that does it, right? And everybody's like, oh yeah, the attorneys, that's what attorneys do, right? But it gives you an opportunity to make mistakes. It's
Mhm.
not really a mistake, right? It gives you the opportunity to kind of push the envelope a little bit, and then and then blame it on your attorney if you want to. I said I'm the greatest foil there is in the world for people.
It's interesting. I can think of a couple of company situations that I've been in conversations with recently. Just, people just like to talk about it.
Yeah.
And we all like to commiserate on what's going on in our businesses or employee issue contracts, customers, vendors. And what you were just talking about, the ability to remedy, is some contracts did and did not have a cap as to what they were liable to.
Yes.
That astounds me. I mean, to me, that's one of the most common things. Yet
Yes.
it's not necessarily in every case, in every contract.
I try to make sure it's in every contract. It's some type of limitation of liability, especially when my client's providing the service. Obviously, if I'm on the other
Mhm.
side, I don't want it, right? And we come to some happy mediums, but it's very nice to put in a contract that I my client is not responsible for consequential damages. What does that mean? It means, let's say I'm giving you that widget, and like I said, you put it in your car, and I guess the car, blows up, but you're no longer able to work for the next 2 weeks. Consequential damages, for lack of a better explanation, is not only do I have to pay you for the car, which my widget destroyed, but now I have to pay you for the 2 or 3 weeks off that you lost as a consequence of my widget destroying the car, right? It's probably a bad example, never happened, but that gives you an idea. We should be taking those out of contracts. I mean, now if they're paying you $1 million per widget, I mean, maybe we should have that in there, right? That's a discussion, but that's what we focus on. What is fair? And in the beginning of any relationship, when you have a deal and people want to get it done, you can get a lot more leeway by just saying, hey, do you really think it's fair that my client's liable for this? Do you really think it's fair that this happens? Do you really think it's fair that that happens? And then they'll listen to you. Even the huge companies, they'll listen to you. And with the huge companies as well, right? Maybe they don't accept it the very first time, right? But I usually start the conversation out like this. If I can't get anything, it's like, okay, I get it. We can't go anywhere, but why don't we make this a 1 year agreement or 2 years agreement? You see how good my client is. And let's make a promise to come back, in another year,
Mhm.
another two. And if you think we're valuable enough, can I get a change on this provision? And the answer is usually yes, right? I mean, it's usually yes, or we'll at least consider doing XYZ, right? And so our client earns something in those contracts with those companies. But like I said, it's always a discussion. And what you're looking for from the very beginning are I guess not, you could say leverage points, but it's really things that will make the other side come to you and say, yeah, I want to make that deal with them. I think that they're stand-up people. They're trying to make sure we all make money. So I do want to work with them on this, right?
And as we're growing our companies, that does evolve and change as to what we're willing to lean to versus not. Because the larger you're growing your company, the more risk you have
Yes.
involved. We talked about that when you're just starting out, make sure the basis contracts. Next is let's make sure we have actual full contracts. Then you get larger, you get 20, 30, 40, $50 million and plus. And sometimes those are just the contracts you use for the last 5, 8, 10 years. We've done so far now. What do you see? Obviously, the risk increases. What do you see as some of the adjustments or updates
Yeah.
that as you increase in size, you do have more leverage, or it just wasn't the case when you were 5 million, but now that you're 50 million, this matters a whole lot more, and we've got to be rethinking our strategy.
And once again, that's more of a conversation. It kind of changes from place to place. But as a business grows, they know where the pitfalls are, right? They know where maybe an assembly line or a supply chain is lacking somewhere, right? They know that there's a probability or possibility that something may not happen the way that they want it to. Or they know on the other side, right? They know
Mhm.
where other people have had issues meeting their demands. And so what we do is we take an analysis of that and we say, okay, well, these are the main issues. Let's flag them for the other side up front, right? And if we can flag them from the other side, then then I can contract around it, right? I can make a deal with them on what happens in those situations. And even better, right? If I know that my supply chain is having an issue in COVID, right? The COVID was
Mhm.
one of the biggest times that this happened because we had the biggest fights over what happens in China. And I know, no offense to anything in China or anything like that, but to be honest, I think the reports on the West Coast that were completely closed, and things were being shipped in from China, and some of my clients needed things done for seasonal projects for their customers. And the question happens, what happens if China or the things coming from
Where
China,
we're sourcing
Singapore,
it,
those
yeah.
types of things don't get in until after the season? What do we do then? How do we get a replacement? What's going to happen? And you contract around those, right?
So do you find that when you meet with clients on a regular basis, as you're talking through this, me and my list mindset wants to start making a list of risks, what didn't go right the last 6 months,
Mm-hmm.
what were we able to easily avoid and handle with the customer, but as we get bigger, or if the customer's not as amenable, we need to have a clause in the contract because sometimes we forget. We just made a phone call to the client, mea culpa, we got it all figured out. We don't think to write that down and discuss it at our next attorney appointment
Yeah.
as to how do we make sure we have this handled. Making that list of our vendor contract, both the vendors to us and issues that could have arisen or did, and then with our customers, and on a regular basis speaking with you, what do we need to adjust our contracts to? Is fortunately we had a good relationship and we're able to avoid it. Next
Yes.
time we may not be so lucky, or as we double in size, this is going to multiply by 5.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I do have meetings with my clients on a regular basis. Some of them are monthly meetings, some of them are quarterly, some of them are every 6 months or so, where we kind of talk through what happened with the contracts over the last 6 months or the last 3 months. Some of my clients who I meet with on a monthly basis, I'm involved with their excuse me, with the clients, with their contracts, that they've dealt
Mm-hmm.
with each month. And then we kind of go over it and we say, okay, well, where is the business heading? And we plan and we strategize so that they don't need me, right? That's really the goal, right? The goal is that this becomes such a well-oiled machine that they don't really need to call me that much. And so that's why we have those meetings, because we identify what those problems are and we resolve them as quick as best we can. And in addition to that, not only do we resolve them by identifying those problems, right? We can now talk to the other side and we create a good relationship with whoever it is. Because number one, we look like we have our act together, because we do, right? We know what the issues are, right? And number two, we've got solutions for each of them, right? I mean, you don't know how easy it is to enter a negotiation where the other side and I, we get together and we talk about, okay, this is what we've seen and this is what we think is going to happen. Let's work together in order to make a good contract. And that working together actually creates a better relationship, because now my client and their customers say, oh yeah, we trust each other, we're going to get it done. And it just, a lot of the contracts I work on, we don't have to worry about too many issues in the beginning, because we've created that strong foundation. And like we had said earlier, we said communication, it starts right there, right? How do we really work together, and what is this whole thing about? That communication creates the relationship that stops litigation in the future. No
Is your
guarantees, obviously. I don't have a crystal ball, but that's
it,
what happens.
is you're talking it through, and you're saying sometimes we just meet on a monthly basis and go through, especially if they're in a high growth or if something they're in a high risk part of their growth. Is it's a lot like a business advisor where they just put them on a retainer, because you don't want the leadership saying, I don't want to start that clock ticking. I don't want that
Yes.
invoice. Versus on a monthly retainer, it's use it or lose it. We might as well call them and get ahead of this and be proactive and schedule a meeting every month.
Exactly. And that's how you and I got together to talk about this. What I've been working on, and a few other attorneys I've been working with,
Mhm.
we are working on a way to have a monthly retainer so that a client knows exactly what their bill is going to be each month, right? And that monthly retainer, it gives so many hours, or possibly, depending upon the client, it might give an unlimited amount of hours for certain projects, right? And so that way they're not afraid to pick up the phone and say, hey, Keith, I'm having a problem with an employee today, or I'm having a problem with the vendor. How do I handle this? How do I send out a letter to them? And then we type up the letter and we send it out.
Mhm.
And I've done that for certain clients. And when they're not afraid to pick up the phone and talk to an attorney, man, yeah, a lot of the problems just kind of go away, because we're sending out that letter. Number one, we're doing the communication. We're doing everything we can to make sure that we're meeting the problem. But number two, they also know, the other side knows that there's an attorney over here, right? And this is not going to be an easy target for me to get with. So I highly recommend it. And I work with clients to figure out, okay, what does that monthly retainer look like? Right. And after a year, we revisit it. Okay, well, maybe we got too much on our end, right? Maybe we made too much money off of this. Okay, so let's lower it down. Or maybe you made too much money off of this, right? Let's raise it up and we figure out what's fair. And once again, fair. You hear that from me all the time, right? Fair, fair,
Yeah.
fair, fair, fair. Let's have an upfront discussion about everything. So we both make money. We both, grow. That's all we really care about.
You never know which 1 hour conversation or 30-minute conversation saved 30 hours of legal fees on the
That's
other end. So, looking at that, what are those business triggers? Or when you look at the cycle from something happened to we're in litigation, what are those trigger points to be able to avoid it? And when you should be that next call. You're a very personable, jovial. I don't think I've ever laughed as hard
Oh
as
yeah.
we're sitting across from each other. So you are a great person to pick up the phone
Thank
and
you.
call, despite being in the legal field there. What are those trigger points besides just calling to say hello to you, Keith,
Yeah.
that it makes sense for them to call?
First thing, obviously, is if somebody says they have a complaint, and that's an employee or a vendor or a partner or anything like that, that your antenna should just go off right then and say, call my attorney. He's on retainer. If you have a friend who's an attorney, call them right away, because they will walk you through what to do, or
Mhm.
maybe they'll just let it go, right? But it's better to know that than to just kind of wing it and hope you don't get sued at some point, or hope you don't have to sue somebody. And it's better to do it up front, because up front the damages are much less generally than later on. All right. So that's number one. Number two is, I'm entering into these contracts with other people. Perhaps I just want somebody to kind of look it over. And once you have an attorney look over some of your contracts, you'll probably never go back, right? I have one client who started that about 2 years ago. He calls me at least twice, I should say twice a week, at least 2 or 3 times a month, just to kind of say, hey, what's going on? And the funny thing is, we now know what each other seems and what each other thinks is important.
Yeah.
So he knows for me, indemnity, right? And liability. I am always concerned about those things. So he said, Keith, right there, paragraph 12 and 13. I want you to really look over those because I know those are very important to you. And then let me know what else happens, right? And it's great. It's a great relationship. I'm like a business advisor. Another thing, let's see, with employees, if you're trying to do an employee handbook, if you're trying to look after, an employee, what do you call that? Healthcare plan, those types of things. I actually don't do healthcare plans. But speaking to your attorney about it is great because if one of my clients came to me, I know a bunch of attorneys who do those types of things. I don't always do construction contracts, but if one of my clients came to me and said they needed it, I'd be like, okay, I know that you could go to this person and they'll take care of you. And I also know them pretty well. Well, I'm a quarterback is essentially what I am,
Yeah.
right? I'm a quarterback for litigation. I'm a quarterback for contracts. I have a lot of different contracts throughout the community. And it's best when the client says, I'm not too sure about this, to come to me and I can send them to attorneys. I can send them to business advisors. I can send them to accountants, all those different things. If they just ask, and I guess that's probably the biggest thing, right? Kind of putting the ego aside or putting the fear aside and just saying, let me give a call. I don't charge clients for that conversation, right? Keith, this is what happened. What's the next steps, right? For that first half hour, it's just, okay, what's the issue and how do we solve it? Right. And then I get them to the right person if it's not me. It's just doing that is number one. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it's the in that's what we do a lot in working with business owners is when we get that phone call when it is chaotic, something has happened, we've got to come in and stabilize the situation. It absolutely is far more costly than when it first started to have an inkling and to call in and help avoid that situation, find a bridge and a transition and go on. But
Yeah.
when we're caught up running our business on a day to day basis and growing our business on a day to day basis, on your list of things to do, call attorney and ask about, that's just going to keep dropping to the bottom. The same
Absolutely.
with my insurance, my CPA, which like you and I have talked about, we need to be more proactive and have those partners who are calling us and
Yes.
saying, how are you doing? Has anything come up? Did you get that 401k issue resolved with that employee that wanted something different? You didn't. Let me give them a call and work through that with you, and we'll get back to you with the solution. Is having those partnerships work for us, not having us as the owner, the leader, having to lead it. It's
Yes.
not on our list of priorities.
No.
Our customers are, our employees are.
You have to make time for it, right? And so I used to run my own firm. I was with a smaller firm, and they also let me have my own firm, I guess, on the side, right?
Mhm.
And I had a business coach, and it was Rich Becker. I remember we were there for a couple of years. We went together, and I decided, oh, I didn't want to pay the $1,500 or whatever it was a month, right? And then I realized that my bottom line was going down. I said to Rich, I made more money with you than without you. And that's what kind of clicked, right? And it's hard for a business owner to see that because at the end of the day, right, it's just one of those expenses on your profit and loss statement. And you think, oh, yeah, I can just, I can save money by doing that. But instead, by having that trusted advisor that takes you out of working in the business and working on the business, right? When you have that trusted advisor and you use them, generally the whole profit and loss, the result goes up. And that's what you
Mhm.
really want to have happen. And for me, especially for attorneys, right, it's difficult because it's hard to quantify how attorneys can save a business money. Because what we save a lot of businesses from are things that generally would never be on the bottom line. If I save you from a $500,000 lawsuit, that's a plus, right? If I save your
Yeah.
insurance rates from going up sometimes, I guess, right? That's a plus. But it's hard to see um, that benefit now. I know one of my clients who comes to me all the time for contracts. They never came to me before a few years back. They came to me when they lost a huge contract because they kind of didn't have protections in their contract. And so now they come to me all the time. And the few $1,000s they pay me a year, right? It's dwarfed by the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they know that they're making, and that they're pretty sure they're not going to lose because the contracts are sound.
There's no balance sheet line item on the asset side saying, I know that I've heard some businesses have a liability line item that
Mhm.
says, potential lawsuit, potential damages, and they'll put a reserve aside. But I haven't heard anyone doing that on the asset side saying, we didn't, we avoided litigation. We avoided
Yes,
all this year. I'm
yes.
gonna, I'm gonna make a line item in my assets. Uh,
Well, generally,
that would be a little more visible. Keith, I
yeah.
always have talking um through these discussions because we get into more the tangible and what it's like to be in a business on a day-to-day versus I've never actually heard you quote law to me or statutes or any of that because it's real and it's tangible. What would be a just if you could take your top one or two pieces of advice for business owners when it comes to mitigating the risk in their business? Because that's the more we can mitigate it,
Uh,
the easier it is to grow. Because there's nothing that halts a business more than that risk in a demand letter or some type of client issue.
yeah,
What's
I
your
know
advice for mitigating that?
yeah, I know communication, right? But let me break down the law. I guess I never really have discussed law with anybody. I try not to
No?
with my clients, right? I've got a very good sense of what is fair.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, that's what the law is supposed to be, right? The law is to figure out what's fair between whatever the dispute is. And like I said earlier, disputes that get to court are really in that gray area, that small gray area where you're not really sure who's right and who's wrong. And so let me give you my job in a nutshell. My job is to figure out what my client did, then figure out what was fair about what my client did, why my client thought that he or she did something right, right? And then express that to the other side and the court. And so what I would say to everybody out there is to figure out what's really fair, right? I mean, a lot of the disputes happen because people are being greedy. And we've seen some Law and Order show that says that this line in the contract means I get away with something. And maybe, I mean, that's very rare when that happens, but the idea is what's fair. And when I get my client to come to me, I ask them, okay, well, why was it fair what you did? What's going on? And then we can turn around and communicate that to the other side. And that that takes away most of the risk. Look, there's accidents out there. There's always going to be accidents. There's nothing we can do about it, right? I mean, there's going to be times that we're blindsided by something we've never seen before. But honestly, I think that's more like 10-20% of the time. And an insurance company usually handles that.
Mhm.
What you and I are talking about right here are real business relationships, and coming back to how to make that relationship predictable, how to make it fair for everybody on it. That's where you really stop a lot of this, because even if there's a fight, if you have a good business relationship and they know you are trying to do something that's right, you can usually calm everything down. People really don't want to go to litigate. I mean, I know we're in that age where everybody wants to fight, and everybody's mad at everybody else, supposedly. Real business people don't take things that personally, right? They want to find a way to end a dispute with certainty instead of going into court and not knowing what's going to happen for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I don't know if that answers your question,
Yeah.
actually, but yeah.
Amen. I like the communication and the fairness. And from my perspective as a business leader, it's the how do I get it resolved or how do I not get to the point where I need to resolve something? It's because
Yeah.
I got to get back to my business.
Yeah.
Nothing
Yeah.
takes your attention away more than, no offense, Keith, than spending a lot of time with you. I want to spend a little bit
Yes.
of time with you, Keith, not a lot of
Yes.
time, because if so,
Yes.
my focus is off my business. And as
Yes.
business owners, we need to be 100% focused on growing our business, taking care of our employees, and letting you do what you do and watching my back.
That's
Keith,
right.
thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm sure that there will be a next time. And absolutely all the best. I know that we've been working on this strategic advisor team and how do we get that brain trust, that protective barrier around a business owner and business leaders together and talking to each other, taking that burden off of the business leaders so they can focus on their business. So there will be more to come.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you again in a couple of months. Thank you.
I love it. Take care.
You too.